My guest today is Craig Warmke. Craig is an assistant professor of philosophy at Northern Illinois University, and his research focuses in the areas of meaning and money. As it relates to money in particular, he's focused on Bitcoin and how it intersects with philosophy, economics, and computer science. Craig, it's great to have you on the show.
Steve, I'm so happy to be here. I can't wait to talk about Bitcoin and related topics.
Well, me too, because I love this idea that you're into philosophy. You teach philosophy, you're a professor of philosophy. And so I think that this idea of how you're trying to use a philosophical framework to understand Bitcoin, I think is going to be very fascinating. And so as I think about Bitcoin, and not just me, but it's a polarizing thing. I mean, you've got on one end of the spectrum, you've got people who think Bitcoin is the greatest thing in the world. It fixes everything. And then on the other side, you've got people who think that it's a con and that it's basically sucking all the energy out of the universe that's been stored for billions of years. And it seems to me that maybe one way that we can understand this polarization is to go into philosophy and to try and understand how do people develop their philosophical belief, whether it's I love Bitcoin or I think it's the devil type thing. And so what I really want to talk about is, first of all, maybe let's start with what is philosophy, and then how are you, and I know you have a couple other colleagues that you're working with in this area, how are you trying to take the idea of philosophy and the frameworks that philosophy has developed to apply that to Bitcoin and trying to help us understand what Bitcoin is?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So philosophy, what is it? Well, philosophy is a lot like pornography in this way. It's very hard to define. What philosophy is itself a philosophical question that people disagree about. So it's hard to define, but people are actually pretty good at pinpointing it when they see it, calling to mind Justice Potter Stewart's quip about pornography. So one of the best things that we can do is we can pinpoint specific questions that everyone agrees are philosophical, and then kind of branch out from there and try to abstract away and say, oh, well, what do these questions have in common that makes them philosophical? So one philosophical question is a question about what exists. So does God exist? Are there tables and chairs? Is there an external reality? Another question is what's causation? So some things cause other things. So what is this relation of causation that happens between events? Another philosophical question might be under what conditions can we reasonably believe something? Another question is, what's money? What makes something money? So these questions are not questions that you will find answers to in any particular science. So we won't find the answer to the question about what causation is in a test tube or a litmus test. And so these are questions that are more fundamental even than the science can tell us. They're fundamental, they're more abstract, and they're fundamental in another way. They're very important to us. And so some of the questions that my colleagues and I, Andrew Bailey and Brad Rattler, they're also philosophers. Some of the questions that we're working on are philosophical questions about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency more generally. So we can apply like the what is question to Bitcoin. What sort of thing is Bitcoin? What is it? That's a question about its nature, and questions about natures are philosophical questions. Another question we could ask is, well, is it overall good? Or who is it good for? And these are questions about goodness, about what good and would invoke some assumptions about what goodness itself is or what goodness for is. And so these are also philosophical questions. And so we're doing our best to try to collect as much evidence as we can from across other disciplines, because Bitcoin is highly interdisciplinary, to try to answer these questions responsibly.
Yeah, and I think,
you're
right. Yeah, and I think this last piece that you said is that Bitcoin crosses so many different disciplines, and that's one of the things that attracted me to it, is that it's not purely just a piece of software, or it's just not code. I mean, it's cryptography, it's economics, it's game theory, it's incentives. I mean, it's a whole series of different areas that once you go into like the top of the funnel here, trying to understand what it is, you have to branch off into all these different areas. And in reading one of the articles that you wrote for CoinDesk, I think that's what you talked about. You're mentioning that philosophers, they draw from whatever evidence is relevant. And with Bitcoin, it spans psychology and economics and cryptography. And that it's really philosophy kind of does the same thing, where you're drawing from all different disciplines. And it's not that you're necessarily going to ask about, what is, but you also said questions about what should or what ought to be, what is good, what is bad, what is just or unjust. So again, I just think this is a great lens through which to think about it, because so many people get hung up on it one way or the other, that maybe if they examine some of their philosophical beliefs, it may help them put it into better context.
That's right. It's so highly interdisciplinary that you really need a bird's eye view to try to do it justice. And that bird's eye view is going to be necessarily philosophical, because it's really only philosophy that that encompasses all these different disciplines. So it's not that as a philosopher, I am an expert in computer science and economics or mathematics. This is not true. But a philosopher is going to try to use bits and pieces of evidence and addressing certain philosophical questions about Bitcoin as they come from these separate disciplines. And so if you are a computer scientist, you need to use your training and your skills in computer science to answer questions in computer science. And if you start doing philosophy, well, you might not have training in philosophy to answer some of these more general questions. The same for economics. If you're going to tackle economic questions about Bitcoin, well, I hope you have some training in economics. Well, okay, well, now these very general questions about what sort of thing is Bitcoin overall, what is its nature, or is it overall good? What are the good things about it? What are the trade-offs? These are going to essentially involve some philosophical aspects, and you need some philosophical training to address these questions, even though you also need to invoke some of these other disciplines. So it's like a lot of very important questions that human beings would care about most. It's very highly interdisciplinary, and that's what makes it so challenging to address responsibly.
Yeah, and I am not an expert in philosophy by any stretch of the imagination. So I know just enough to be dangerous here. So I'm going to be asking you some questions about it. And what I'm hoping we'll do here is we'll start off really kind of getting a better understanding of what philosophy is, and then we'll start applying that to Bitcoin and trying to use the frameworks here again to help us understand that. So let's talk about this area of philosophy called epistemology.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that's really trying to understand what knowledge is. So that particular aspect of philosophy, if you can describe what is that, and then how does that apply to us trying to figure out, well, what can we really know here? And what can we really know about what Bitcoin is? And how does that aspect of a philosophical framework help us here?
Oh, such a great question. So epistemology, etymologically, just means the study of knowledge, just like you said, but it encompasses more. So it concerns how we acquire and assess evidence. What does it mean to believe something justifiably? And like you say, what does it mean to know something? And well, how do these issues apply to Bitcoin? Well, I think in just the way that you hinted at the beginning of our conversation, that there are people who disagree about Bitcoin, and sometimes in a very heated and an emotional way. We have charges of bias, and on top of that, we have some sorts of tribalism, and so people are tempted to conform and and show these displays of being in the in group and attack people in the out group. And I think that more careful attention to how it is that human beings form biases and how we can overcome them can help us adjudicate this really tough, chaotic situation when you have this highly controversial issue that requires expertise to some extent in several fields in order to understand. And it's hard to know who to trust. So who should we trust? Who are the experts? Can I rationally disagree with someone who's an expert in the field that I'm not? Or if we're both experts in a certain field, what happens after we disagree? Should I lower my credence? Should I give up my belief? Should I suspend my belief? And so once we pay more closely attention to these kinds of issues about the nature and kinds of human biases, I think we can start to get a grip in some ways on what's going on around Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin itself just chugs along. It doesn't care. But the human communities around Bitcoin, then we can start to sift them out, I think.
So let's talk about this idea of a belief system. So let's say one belief is, I think the world is inherently bad. People are inherently bad. Left to their own devices, they're going to be evil. Another person might think the world is inherently good and people are inherently good. So how do we come to know, how do we develop those belief systems? How do we come to know whether it's right or wrong? And is there an ability for us over time, if we started out thinking the world is evil, how do we shift over time to, oh, actually, I think the world is good now?
Yeah, great question. I think most of us, and this is me included in certain areas, most of us run on autopilot. And so we never really take time apart from our everyday lives to carefully consider these deeper questions. And because we don't, we just run with answers to these questions that seem most natural to us. And so we run on emotion and intuition rather than on careful reflection. Oh, well, so suppose you do want to take time out and stop the autopilot, and start to engage in a more reflective way. How can someone do this? And I think the first thing that someone needs in order to do this is a more reflective attitude, an open attitude, an attitude that both communicates and manifests a desire to learn from people, even people that you disagree with. And so rather than wanting to dismantle someone else's belief system who disagrees with you, you can say, okay, I'm putting my weapons down. What can I learn? What can I learn from you, even though I think you're probably wrong? And then actually listening. And so what I'm getting at here is a kind of philosophical mindset. What philosophers do is they weigh the reasons for and against certain views, arguments, opinions. And we can do this for both the people that we disagree with and for our own beliefs. And in doing this, we can also start to investigate the ways in which we ourselves might be biased, so that we can at least be honest with ourselves about the reasons that some of the hidden reasons behind our own beliefs.
So let's talk about that. And as it relates to this idea that we have delusions, there are certain things where we're deluding ourselves. So let's take, this is not a political show, but I think this is a good example. So let's take the 2020 presidential election. So Joe Biden was declared the winner, and there's still a significant percentage of people who think that Joe Biden did not win the presidential election. So what would philosophy say about that in terms of how do we try and separate the logic and the reason from a situation, something that happened, and trying to get to the truth of, well, what is truth, versus people who may conveniently ignore what seems to be reasonable and logical, and they're deluding themselves, but they get some psychic benefit, they get some payoff from the fact that I'm deluding myself, but it's solving some other need that I have. So as humans, we're these emotional animals. And so some people, they get some emotional payoff from believing something that may be patently false. Does philosophy say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is really hard. So there are some philosophers, the skeptics, who will say that we basically don't know anything. And if you don't know anything, then it's going to be hard to start wars about certain controversial beliefs. Because if you admit that you don't know anything, then it's probably not worth it to try to fight to the death for something that for all you know is false. But I'm not myself a skeptic, but I think that careful attention to some of these skeptical arguments can help us sift out some of these unhealthy epistemic behaviors, behaviors as they relate to belief and opinion. So I think we have a tendency to downplay our weaknesses, whether in character or mind, and magnify the weaknesses of others. There are names for these biases. There's like, self-protective, self-enhancement biases, and then there's like the fundamental attribution error. So this is where we magnify others' character flaws and so on to explain away some of the things that they do. And I think once we realize that we have these kinds of biases that would, on autopilot, affect our behavior, well, then we can start to think, well, maybe this isn't something worth fighting over. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong about this. And so this is especially true in politics because our political beliefs get so deeply intertwined with our hearts, with our emotional centers. And if that's the case, then an attack on our political belief it feels like an attack on us. It feels like an attack on me at my core. And I think the answer then is to try to help in each of our own cases untangle these deeply emotionally held political beliefs from our hearts and say, that's out there. I'm separate from it. And I also have biases that I'm subject to that would incline me towards believing certain things, that would also incline me towards magnifying the faults in others. And I think all these considerations should lead us to be somewhat skeptical about our political beliefs. And once we're more skeptical about those political beliefs, I don't think things would be as heated. And I don't think that we'd have as many people suffering from, these kinds of delusional beliefs that you suggested. So.
Yeah, and I like this idea of being a skeptic, because this is something that I've talked to people for many, many years in the financial services, for example. So what I say to people is, you need to understand the bull case and you need to understand the bear case. So even though you may think, hey, I think the market's going to go up forever, you need to talk and you need to read and you need to hear from the people who have the opposite position. And then you want to get the information. Then you can start making a more reasonable decision on, well, this was my bias toward, I think it's going up forever. But now this person over here, who's the skeptic, who's the bear, they've got some points that I need to consider here. Maybe it's going to temper my enthusiasm a little bit. And in fact, just before you and I started talking here today, I sent a tweet out about a podcast that I had done earlier that was definitely a bullish case for Bitcoin. And an advisor tweeted back to me and said, "Hey, I love the show, but I'm just wondering, where's the bear case? Can you point me in the direction of the bear case?" And I sent him an example of an article that was really the opposite side. Yeah. And I basically congratulated him and said, "This is great. You're doing your fiduciary duty, which is to try and understand both sides of the question so that you, as the professional, can make the informed decision." So I think this idea of having some skepticism is definitely well warranted here.
Yeah, and I think the way that you mentioned gathering evidence in this way is really important. And it's a big problem with contemporary society, where we only look for evidence in the places that we are apt to find evidence that would support our own views. And so for example, suppose I'm a huge Bitcoin bull, which I am. Should I only read things written by other people who think Bitcoin is going to continue to go parabolic? Well, no, I should not want to do that, because the reasons that I might be missing out on might cost me financially. They might be the sorts of reasons that I would lack and not communicate to others, and I could hurt other people financially by not having this information. So I think one of the best books in epistemology is called Knowing Our Limits by a philosopher named Nathan Ballantyne. It is beautifully written, it's accessible, and it's about all these issues that we've been talking about. And this is a problem that he calls the problem of the significance of unpossessed evidence. So anytime you're engaging in some sort of inquiry about an important topic, you need to ask yourself, do I have all the relevant evidence? Is it possible that there's evidence out there that would call into question my viewpoint? And most likely there is. On any topic, especially any controversial topic or complex topic, there's going to be unpossessed evidence that we don't have that bears on that topic. And if we had it, would result in lowering our credence, or the strength of our belief. And so I think that this is a kind of practice that we should all cultivate, looking for evidence that would counter our viewpoints, even in places that we wouldn't normally look.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying, I'm thinking of, there's three aspects here. That is, we're thinking about philosophy, and we're thinking about behavioral psychology in terms of whether it's Bitcoin or anything for that matter. And if we've got a strong opinion one way or the other, three things, I'll call them little tools that we should use here. One is to have a healthy skepticism. So if you're far in one direction, you need to tell yourself, okay, what's the skeptical side of this? What's the other viewpoint? So that's one. A second is, you talked about this idea of trying to detach yourself. So if someone is attacking you for your belief, don't take it personally. Just kind of put that out to the side and look at it as a detached third party. So maybe you can take some of the emotion out of how you're reacting. And then I'll add a third. I don't know that we've touched on this yet, but I'm going to call it the ego. And I think sometimes we get so wrapped up that if we believe something and we've created our identity around believing this, and now someone's challenging it, it's like, how dare you? It's like, I don't want to admit that, well, maybe I was wrong about that.
Yeah. Admitting you're wrong is really hard. And I think we especially see this. I think so. Bitcoiners would be happy to point this out, that because it's pointing it out in someone else. That there are these famous, non-Bitcoiners or anti-Bitcoiners who came out publicly against Bitcoin several years ago, and they've not yet changed their mind, and they've been wrong for several years. And I don't need to name any names, but there are very smart people, prize-winning economists, professors. I mean, these people are brilliant. They could just walk all around me with their knowledge about like monetary economics, But they've been wrong in this one thing, and they are seemingly unwilling to admit that they've been wrong. And I think this, instead of taking a victory lap, this should lead Bitcoiners to think, oh, what maybe have I been wrong about? What might I be wrong about in the future? That if I were to encounter evidence contrary to my view, would I try to ignore or diminish in some way? So I really like that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, at the risk of going, too far here with this epistemology and this idea of knowledge, let's talk about this concept of faith, because there's some things that we really can't understand through reason or logic, and we just say, well, I just have faith in it or in that. So how should we, does faith come into this? I mean, let's maybe apply it to Bitcoin. I think there's a lot of reason to justify that it makes sense, but are there some things, whether it's Bitcoin or something else, where we say, I just have faith in that and I can't prove it. I can't logically or reason my way into that belief. What does philosophy have to say about the idea of faith?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So take a couple of different cases. So one case where you see a chair in the room and you're tired, you want to sit down. You've never sit in that chair. You've never sat in that chair before. So you don't know for certain that it won't just collapse underneath your weight the second that you sit down. But you sit down in it anyway. I think that's a kind of faith. It's a faith in the structural integrity of the chair. And you might, I think under most circumstances, we'd say that you know that the chair is not going to collapse just by the way it looks and so on.
Now, but is that faith? Is that faith, or is that more pattern recognition, where I've seen what a chair looks like before, that looks like what I've seen before, I'm going to match that pattern. So does that apply at all?
Yeah, good. So these things are not incompatible. So you can have this pattern recognition with faith, because you don't 100% know that the chair is not going to collapse. And if your life depended on it, you'd probably think twice before sitting on it. But then, the most famous case of faith that philosophers most often talk about is faith in God or some kind of religious being. And there are differences of opinion about what faith is and whether one should have it. I'm of the opinion that faith is compatible with having a justifiably high credence in the thing, and even a fairly low credence. So just as a bit of biography, I converted to the Orthodox Church several years ago. So I am myself religious. And it's a very important part of who I am. However, as far as my credence goes, like with how strongly I believe, it fluctuates just wildly. Sometimes I'm fairly certain. Sometimes I'm not certain at all, or actively doubt, even while I engage in certain religious traditions and practices. I would say that's a kind of faith, whether it's the credence is high or low. And I think there's something, you can have faith in Bitcoin in both of these two ways. So I think as far as the structural integrity of the network goes, that it's very reasonable to have that kind of faith in Bitcoin. It's a very secure, widely distributed network. It's very unlikely that things are going to fall apart. Metaphorically, if you sit on it, it's not going to fall. It's not going to fall as soon as you try to transact on it or store your money in it. But as far as having a kind of this kind of more religious faith in Bitcoin, I would be more skeptical. So you do see people, like, for example, on Bitcoin Twitter, that have this kind of more religious faith in Bitcoin. They think that Bitcoin is going to solve all these problems, societal problems. And I think this is unhealthy. probably not true. And so there are the grades or strengths of faith. And I think having the sort of faith in Bitcoin that you'd have in a chair, but for your money, that's reasonable. Having faith in Bitcoin like you'd have faith in God, some people would say it's idolatrous. I might say it's maybe unwise or unhealthy or unreasonable. But then there's there's all these grades in between, and there's kind of a gray area. It's hard to say much about.
Yeah, and I think it kind of gets back to this idea of delusions. And I've been reading a book called Useful Delusions by Shankar Vedantam. And the basic idea is that there are some things that we believe, even though we can't maybe prove them. And let's take, God as an example. Some people would say, well, if you have faith in God, well, that's just a delusion because we can't necessarily prove the existence of God or Jesus or Abraham or the prophet or whoever. But if people have that faith, that could be useful to them because of how it helps them live their life, or it helps them cope with the loss of a loved one or something like that. And so he kind of makes the argument that there is such a thing as a useful delusion that helps solve some emotional or psychological need that you have.
Yeah, I think we all have some need for some kind of religious faith, whether it's in science or religion or something like Bitcoin. But I think some of these are better or worse ways of allocating faith. And as far as Bitcoin goes, it's not going to solve all of our societal ills. I do have a lot of trust in it. I think it's a great thing, but I also think that there are ways in which, in the past, some of this kind of religious faith in Bitcoin has served people well, in just the way you mentioned, because they've become insanely wealthy from being like a Bitcoin maximalist. Investing only in Bitcoin and everything else is garbage. But even though this kind of religious faith in Bitcoin has served people well in the past, it doesn't mean the content of that faith is true. It could just been useful for that person for a certain amount of time. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's kind of keep with this idea here of delusion for a minute. And I want to read a quote from a book. It's called Bitcoin is Magic, and it was written by David Morse. And it's really a fascinating book. I definitely would encourage people to read it. But here's what he says about Bitcoin. This is a quote here. He says, Bitcoin is in fact a mass delusion in the same sense as the thousands of years of ritual and faith are a mass delusion. It is also a mass delusion in the same sense that effectively all forms of money are a mass delusion. Every form of abstract symbolic value, whether gold or sardine cans, gains its power primarily from social agreement, not from any fundamental underlying real value. So I think he's got a way with words for sure. Yes. And but I think this idea, I'm going to imagine that you've got some thoughts on money and philosophically, what is money? Is it this mass delusion, this shared delusion, this abstraction? How do you think about money as a philosopher?
Well, I think there are two questions that separate from each other. One is, what is the thing that is or might serve as money? So what is the thing that might serve as money? And then secondly, what makes that thing, whatever it is, money? So what makes something money, then what's the thing that is money? So those are two different questions. So I agree.
Is this the idea of the signify and signified, or?
Well, yes, yeah. So what makes something money, whatever that thing is? We'll discuss that in a second.
Yeah. Okay.
So what makes something money? Well, I think, was it Morris, the author that you just read? I think there is something collective to it, but it's not necessarily a delusion. It's a shared belief. It doesn't have to be delusional. So it's a shared belief that this thing that I give to you for shoes, you believe someone else will accept for bowling balls or whatever. So it's this shared belief that we'll all accept this thing as a kind of scale for trade. So in that it can serve as a medium of exchange, as the kind of common node around which we trade everything else. A unit of account, so it's a way that we measure value with respect to all these other things. And as a store of value. So, you know, in between the time that we exchange it, we can hold it and it will retain the value that we measure other things with respect to. So I think that's just a kind of shared belief. And we have this kind of trust in each other that this thing is going to preserve its status as a form of money. That is, its status as this thing that other people trust will be exchangeable. So I don't think that's delusional. There's no false belief. There's no false belief there. It's just a belief, a kind of trust in the thing and a trust in the other human beings who want to trade for that thing. And then we get to the other question. Well, what is the thing that would serve as money? And this is going to elicit a different answer for the different kinds of things that can serve as money. I think almost anything can serve as money. And so, so gold, for example, can serve as money. You can just take the gold, stamp it, put my face on it here, King Craig. Here's whatever portion of gold. Give me some shoes. Gold's a commodity, and it's a metal, but it's a commodity. It's a commodity because it has a non-monetary use. So apart from exchanging it for other things and using it as a store of value and unit of account and medium of exchange, we can use it for jewelry. We can paint it on domes, and it looks pretty. It serves as a status symbol and all sorts of things. So that's gold. And then you have fiat money or state-issued fiat money, which has no non-monetary use, or essentially no. I mean, I suppose someone could put it on a necklace, it'd be kind of gauche, but someone could do that. But this is not typically how dollar bills are used or checks. We use them just to pay taxes, just to trade goods, just to store in the bank account. We can't use them to drive. We can't use them to play sports with and so on. Okay, so fiat money has no non-monetary use. It's only has a monetary use. And then comes Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is, in some sense, it shares aspects with both fiat money and commodity money. So Bitcoin is like gold in that it's a commodity. In my view, and so so now we're getting into some metaphysics. And so in my view, Bitcoin is what George Selgin calls a synthetic commodity. It's a commodity like Bitcoin in that it's a substance, but it's not a physical substance. It's an abstract substance. And that's what I think Selgin means by synthetic. He means something like digital. And in my view, Bitcoin is like a fictional substance that the whole network secures inside of a massively co-authored story. So it would be as if we are all writing a story about butterbeer and trading certain quantities of butterbeer, but there would be no real thing butterbeer. We would just pass notes to each other on this network saying that, oh, here's 1 cup of butterbeer, here's 2 cups, and so on. So Bitcoin is like that. So it's an abstract substance, or as Selgin calls it, a synthetic commodity. But precisely because it's abstract or fictional or whatever you want to call it, it has no non-monetary use. It's not something that you can wear. It's not something that you can put in your teeth. It's not something that you can paint on domes. So in that way, it's also like state-issued fiat money in that it's purely monetary. So Bitcoin is a synthetic commodity. So it's a commodity like gold, but with only monetary use, like state-issued fiat money. And I think once you start thinking about it in this way, you see that both dollars or other kinds of fiat currencies and Bitcoin are similar in another way, which is that dollars were abstract all along, just like Bitcoin. And that's why they have only monetary use. So, you know, I don't have any dollar bills on me, but suppose I have a $20 bill. It has a 20 on the bill. I hand it to you. What have I handed you? I've handed you $20, but I've also handed you one bill. One cannot be 20. One does not equal 20. So there are two different things here. There's the singular physical bill, and then there are the 20 units, the $20 that the bill itself signifies. So we have to distinguish between the instrument, the financial instrument, the bill, and then the actual currency, the dollars. Well, this is exactly what's going on in Bitcoin. So we transfer Bitcoin on the Bitcoin network through what's called UTXOs. That stands for unspent transaction outputs. So if I send you a Bitcoin, I've claimed some Bitcoin that was sent to me in the past to one of my addresses. I sign it over with a digital signature, and I send it to you like a digital check. And so that digital check will say, this is not technically how it goes, but it's close enough. It says, to Steve's address for one Bitcoin. And so we have that same issue. We have the signifier, that is the bill, which is the UTXO, which is itself digital. So we've dematerialized the document. But even though we've dematerialized the document is not itself the Bitcoin. Why? Well, they have different properties. If I hand you a $1 bill, well, now we have a bill, a single bill, and a single dollar. But the bill is not the dollar. I think this is something that would be surprising to a lot of people. If I hand you a dollar bill, I've handed you two things. I've handed you the bill, and then I've handed you the dollar, which the bill signifies. And these come apart because you can give the dollar bill to your bank, and they will put the bill in your bank account. And now that dollar has been transferred into like a bank account. So then we separate, the dollar from the bill. And also we see that they're different with respect to the $20 bill. So we have the 20 and then the 1. And then we can see then in Bitcoin, the same thing is happening. If I send you a UTXO with 20 Bitcoin, well, we have one digital document, the UTXO, then we have 20 Bitcoin. So those are different. So the same would be true with one Bitcoin. So one digital document, one Bitcoin, they're different things. One is the currency, and then one is the digital document. They have different properties. So I've been rambling for a long time, but I think the answer to your question is that when we separate these two questions, what makes something money? And then what's the thing that has money? We see that what makes a thing money is not necessarily a collective delusion, but a collective belief. And what that belief is something like trust that other people will accept whatever it is that might serve as money to trade around and store and so on. And then we can ask this other question, well, what's the thing serving as money? And then when we do that, we see that, well, all sorts of things can serve as money in different and important ways. And Bitcoin serves as a special kind of money. It straddles the fence between commodity money like gold and fiat, state-issued fiat money like the US dollar.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of threads there that you just talked about that we could dive into here for just a minute. So one is this idea of intrinsic value. And I don't think you used the phrase intrinsic value, but a lot of people complain about Bitcoin and say it has no, quote, intrinsic value. But when you think about the US dollar as a fiat currency, it has no, quote, intrinsic value. And sure, some people say, well, you know, it's backed by the full faith and credit of the US government, and it's a taxing authority, and the government says, this is what we will accept when you pay your taxes, that sort of thing. So that gives it something of credibility. But I think then when you talk about this idea of the signify and signified, I'm going to read a quote here. It's fairly long, but this is from your paper, What is Bitcoin? And I think it helps shine a light on this idea of intrinsic value, and to realize that neither the dollar nor Bitcoin essentially have any, quote, intrinsic value in the way that investment professionals think about it, where it spits off cash flow. So you talk, here's a quote from you, say, finally, how, if at all, does Bitcoin's fictional status differentiate it from fiat currencies like the US dollar? As I argue elsewhere, I think not much. Typically, what signifies isn't identical to what is signified. So a $20 bill is not itself the quantity of $20 that the bill signifies. Just like a $1 bill is not itself the quantity of $1 that the bill signifies either. But what are these things, the dollars that the bills signify? They are quantities of a fictional substance, in my view. Bitcoin differs from the dollar, however, in a crucial way. Whether a financial instrument successfully signifies dollars heavily depends on whether the US government says it does, but no centralized body has similar control over Bitcoin. So again, a number of things going on there, but one is, I think there's no intrinsic value. Two is the US government is basically, you know, signifying that the dollar has value because we say it does, and that's what we're going to accept for taxes. But Bitcoin is different because it's this decentralized, there's no centralized authority. It's the collective belief of the entire network of all the miners and everyone that's verifying the blockchain.
Yeah, that's right. So I think this is a really important part about Bitcoin. There's no centralized authority that says, you know, this thing over here shall be deemed Bitcoin and we will accept it for, you know, thus and so, whatever, as the US government does for the US dollar. And the government has done this often over the last couple hundred years, saying this is the dollar, this is no longer the dollar, or a dollar represents this amount of gold. Or, I mean, there's this funny story in Amity Schle's The Forgotten Man about how FDR would walk into his office one day in the early 30s. This is during the Depression. And he would say, all right, what shall we make the dollar worth today? And he had picked out some calculation using like 7 and 13 because they were his lucky numbers. And so here we have someone not only saying, the US government saying what could serve as a dollar, but how much it could be redeemed for in gold. And so, you know, when you have a currency that is backed in this way, and its backing is, you know, regulated by a centralized institution, then you have the dollar as being centralized in two important respects. Not only what can serve as the dollar, but how much it would be worth. Whereas with Bitcoin, Bitcoin has neither of these things. It's not backed, of course, just like the US dollar is no longer backed. And by that we mean it's not like redeemable for some other thing that it represents, but it's still credible or trustworthy because of the security of that the whole network provides. And now this is not true for all cryptocurrencies, and I think Bitcoin is pretty special in this way. So if you look at the next most important cryptocurrency, Ethereum, it does seem to me that there is a centralized institution, if not a single central authority, who has the power, not an official power, but a power to say, this over here is going to be Ethereum now, not this. And we will see this. I mean, the plan is that we'll see this in the next couple of years when Ethereum abandons the network it exists on. So let me distinguish between the network and the asset. So Bitcoin is an asset. It also exists and is secured by a network that we call the Bitcoin network. The Ethereum network secures Ether, the asset. Ether can, because of these central authorities, they're treated as central authorities among Ethereans. Ether is going to leave behind the Ethereum network and jump to a wholly different network. And then that's going to be Ethereum, the Ethereum network, because people have agreed beforehand that that network will secure Ether. Well, who are these special people in Ethereum? Well, you have Vitalik, who is a very important figure in Ethereum, and then you have like the Ethereum Foundation, and I think most Ethereans would follow them as they have followed them in the past towards the asset, whatever asset they call Ether is Ether. Whereas with Bitcoin, this is not quite true. It's much more decentralized and less like the U.S. government.
Right. So we can also talk about money. I hear people talk about how money is a language, and it's a language that we use to express values. So if I give you $1, I'm exchanging $1 with you, and in return, I'm getting something. So it's a language to express value and communication. So do you think of money or Bitcoin in that way as well? And again, I know you've talked about in your paper about, you were comparing the Bitcoin network to the authorship of a book. And yeah. So maybe you're thinking about this idea of language as well.
Yeah, I think they're very closely related. So I have a mental model for how to understand the various components of the Bitcoin network and how the network and the asset and the software kind of all relate to each other. And here's how I put it. So Bitcoin, the asset, is not itself a language. It's an abstract substance. But it's an abstract substance that is signified by a language. And that's the language that's encoded in the Bitcoin ledger, which says which addresses have which amounts of Bitcoin. And so the language there is the ledger. And the ledger is very important. If it disappeared, we would know who would have which amounts of Bitcoin. Bitcoin would die, at least temporarily, before someone else resurrected something similar. So I don't think that Bitcoin, the asset, is itself a language, but I think it essentially depends on this kind of formal language that the Bitcoin ledger is written in. And that Bitcoin ledger is a lot like a massively co-authored book, a story where users, when they transact, they submit these little formal sentences saying, Craig sends 1 Bitcoin to Steve. And then that gets routed into the network where there are referees who judge whether or not that sentence is going to be like grammatically correct, whether it coheres with the earlier parts of the story. And then if those referees called nodes give it the check mark. They pass it on to these competitive publishers who compete to publish blocks of these sentences as the next chapter into the story. And we call these competitive publishers miners. How they compete is by digging through mathematical space to solve a kind of mathematical puzzle so that they win the right to insert not only their chapter as the next chapter in the Bitcoin story, but a sentence in that chapter which rewards themselves some of that abstract substance of Bitcoin for winning that for winning that competition. And so, although Bitcoin the asset is not itself a language, I think the language is like really closely tied to what makes Bitcoin what it is.
Yeah, and I like how in your paper, What is Bitcoin, you mentioned the model. And so you're trying to say, okay, here's how something else works in, quote, the real world that we all understand, whether it's making of bread, whether it's authoring a book. And then you say, okay, now that we know how that works, let's take a look at the Bitcoin network and see how similar the components of the Bitcoin network would apply to this other thing over here that we all have a pretty good understanding of. And this idea of the book, I think, is really interesting. And I got another quote here right along these lines. You said, the Bitcoin blockchain is a digital book. The thousands of people daily sending Bitcoin really are co-authoring on a massive scale without a central authority. It is by far the largest and longest running case of hyper authorship in human history. So just like David Morse, you've got a way with words as well. So
thank you.
So I think that's interesting. This idea of the blockchain, we're basically every 10 minutes, we're appending the recent transactions to the previous blocks. And it's just this longest running case of hyper authorship, as you described here, I think is an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for reading. I appreciate that. So I think it's also important to note that these transactions that are appended every 10 minutes in like chunks, they aren't transferring they aren't transferring ownership of strings of symbols when we transact Bitcoin. All the transaction really does is say that, well, this certain quantity of Bitcoin now goes to this address, and that's it. And so there are these just primitive quantities without discrete individuals. And I think this is important for understanding Bitcoin's privacy model and fungibility, because if all you're trading around is certain quantities, and the quantities are in some sense traceable, but as soon as you start mixing the quantities, then the histories of those quantities get smeared across all each other, as if we poured our cups of coffee together, and we could only trace where the cups have gone, but we had no ability to trace the molecules. That's what it's like in Bitcoin. There are no molecules. They are just the cups of Bitcoin.
Right. So it's not like we can look and see, oh, there's my Bitcoin and there's your Bitcoin. It's basically like a ledger that says you own X amount of Bitcoin or X number of Satoshis. So it's almost like a bank account, really, where if I initially made a deposit in a bank account, I never see those dollars again. Everything's digital, and I log in and it says, oh, you have $3,000 in this account, but it's not like I can physically see those dollars that are signifying the signified here, which is the actual money.
Yeah, that's right. And the Bitcoin ledger is different from a traditional bank account in one way, and that's that the Bitcoin ledger does not run on an account-based model. It instead runs on a UTXO-based model. So instead of thinking of Bitcoin as being held in accounts, and then the ledger updates by subtracting or adding more to the account, it's more like Bitcoin is you have like a vault with all the checks that have been sent to you. And so you have all your checks, and you can say, okay, now I have a check for 1 Bitcoin, a check for 0.5, a check for 0.15 Bitcoin. How do I want to group these together or split them apart to spend here? And so every Bitcoin you send is essentially tied to its most recent transaction, but that's all. Unlike a bank account, where once it goes in, it's just like, just in the account.
So let me make sure I understand this. So let's say I go to the post office and I see a whole wall of post office boxes, and they have a number on them. And then I have a key that opens up one of those post office boxes. So is that box like the UTXO, where whoever has the key, it's a bearer instrument.
Yes.
You own the key to that post office box. You can open it up and you can essentially, quote, be the owner of what might reside in there. And you have the ability to take what's in there and put it in somebody else's box if you want.
Yeah.
Is that maybe a way to think about it?
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Yeah. Thanks, Steve.
Good. You can steal that.
I probably will. With due credit, though.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Well, you're an academic, so you got to make sure you don't want to plagiarize anything.
I don't want to be fired. So
no. All right. Well, Craig, I know there's a lot of other avenues that we could be going down here. I've been asking a lot of questions. Are there some things that I haven't asked you yet where you think this would really be a good area for us to go into? I know we're kind of bumping up on time here, but anything else that you want to mention here that we may not have addressed yet?
Well, I think just careful reflection, I mean, whether someone is ultimately pro-Bitcoin or anti-Bitcoin, I think that careful reflection on the kinds of biases that we might bring to the table could help increase the level of discourse. And so, you know, one way that this might help is that it's very easy to attribute a bias to someone else because, for example, they own Bitcoin. So of course they're going to be pro-Bitcoin or argue that Bitcoin's energy consumption is justifiable. Or this person works for a Bitcoin company. So of course they're going to make this pro-Bitcoin argument. So it's not worth reading. I encounter these kinds of arguments fairly regularly. I also encounter arguments on the other side. So for example, I'm thinking of a relatively famous monetary economist who's famously anti-Bitcoin, but he gets no respect. He gets no respect for the work that he's done outside of Bitcoin. And so attributing bias to him may not be the best way. I think we have lots of things that we could learn from people like him. And then on the flip side, our own biases are often transparent to us in the sense that we don't see them. We are kind of fundamentally blind to the biases that affect our own belief systems. And so if you're going to try to find your own biases, you won't find them. You'll think, well, I'm not biased. Well, no, you probably are. And there are all sorts of reasons why each of us is. I mean, so one way I'm biased is that, well, lots of my friends are Bitcoiners. I value, praise from friends. I want to avoid disagreement with friends. So there's pressure to conform. I also have, maybe a small financial stake in Bitcoin. And so I think being honest with ourselves about our potential biases, whichever side we're on, can help us have more productive conversations. And I think, so it sounds to me like one of the guiding themes of our conversation here, especially thanks to you, is that a little bit of skepticism could go a long way.
Yeah, I think the skepticism, I think just this idea of keeping an open mind, I think so often, whether it's Bitcoin or anything else, we just, we have an immediate opinion. I'm pro this or I'm anti that. And we don't leave any room for, well, let me just take a look at this a little bit more and be open to the idea that maybe there's something here for me to learn. Maybe there's something I hadn't considered. Maybe somebody else has a thought process or some rationale here that might actually make sense to me. And so again, that kind of gets back to the ego thing as well, that if we can check our ego at the door. We talked a little bit about this idea of being tribal. As humans, it seems like, and we've always been tribal, but it seems like in recent years, we're even more tribal than ever before. And you just talked about here, like, we don't want to be ostracized from our friends if we have a different opinion from them. And so we want to kind of go along with what our friends are thinking too, and be part of the tribe here. So we've got all these interesting dynamics as human beings that sometimes make it difficult for us to change, and oftentimes give us incentives to stay with where we are and stay with our belief system, because it protects us in some way. So it's not easy to kind of deal with these things, and people like you who are philosophers who really study these things in depth and really contemplate this. And we've got, thousands of years of history of people that have been thinking about this as well and developed frameworks. I think it's super helpful. So Craig, I really appreciate this time. Hopefully we'll get a chance to connect again, because I know there's other areas that we could delve into here as well.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed this. And I just have one more thought. So along with what you just said about biases, I think some people will not even read some pro-Bitcoin arguments because they're coming from a pro-Bitcoin source. And I want to encourage people not to ignore this evidence in this way for two reasons. One reason is that some people who have a financial stake in Bitcoin, either because they hold it or because they work for a Bitcoin company, they do that because they've already worked through the arguments and they want to enact their vision of the good into the world. And so they have skin in the game. And so rather than their stake being a reason to ignore, it's actually a reason to take them seriously, because they put their professional reputation at stake on this controversial thing. So that's a reason to take them seriously. Another reason is because I think Bitcoin is actually good. I think that the arguments are, they actually point in favor of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is overall good, and the critics, for the most part, have not done their homework. I think that's not attributing bias to someone. It may be attributing laziness or something, but just as someone who tries to be an independent observer as much as possible, there is one side of the debate here that just hasn't done their homework. And I think I speak for myself and my collaborators, Andrew Bailey and Brad Rettler, in wishing that our critics were more responsible, because everyone benefits when the criticisms are actually good. And you can find some of our work at our website, resistance.money.
Excellent. Yeah. And I think this idea of, we talked about trying to understand the opposite position. So if I'm an advocate of Bitcoin, you're an advocate of Bitcoin, but I think we need to be able to eloquently advocate for the opposite of our position. We need to understand what is the opposite of what we believe, and we need to be able to state it as well as the critic could state it. And that, I think, again, gets back to this idea of understanding both sides, making an informed opinion. So Craig, so we've got resistance money what was it? Resistance money. What was the address?
Resistance.money.
Resistance.money. Excellent. Yeah. And then, so they can get access to you there. We mentioned this paper, What is Bitcoin? I know there's a link to that there as well. You've been on some other shows, and we'll have links to these things as well on my website, which is stevesandusky.com. And you can you can find all this here. So, so Craig, this has been awesome, and appreciate all the great work that you and your colleagues are doing in this area. And I look forward to connecting with you again down the road.
Oh, I'd love to. So thank you, Steve.